The following program is made possible by Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo, the next stage.
The economy is in disarray, and the race for governor of California is heating up.
Our guest today, Tom Campbell, former congressman, economics expert, and maybe a candidate for governor. The game is politics, and the game is on.
I'm Bob Marks.
And I'm Mark Simon. Welcome to the game. We're pleased to be joined by an old friend of ours, former congressman, former state senator, former finance director for the state of California, former dean of the Haas School of Business at Berkeley. What are you doing now?
I'm a professor at Berkeley.
Good.
On leave, and I'm going to be a visiting professor at Chapman University in Orange County.
Excellent. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Bob.
We're particularly happy to have you here to talk about the economy. You certainly know your economics. Let's start with the national level. Clearly, the prevailing premise is the federal government is the way to stimulate ourselves out of this mess. Is that a theory you subscribe to? Is that the right thing to be doing right now?
Yes, we've tried virtually everything else. You can't get interest rates to get much lower. So there's monetary policy, there's fiscal policy to stimulate individual consumption, and fiscal policy to stimulate government consumption. Monetary policy. Federal Reserve has lowered interest rates to historic lows. The real interest rate is negative, so that's about as far as you can go. Getting consumers to buy so that we have a revived economy. Well, it's almost quaint to recall the $160 billion stimulus package last summer. 160 was a big number in those days, and it didn't have much effect. And then the fall in the price of gasoline is another significant one. Since last summer, prices of gas were about $4.38 in California. And now they're about $1.80, $1.85. That difference alone should pump into the national economy over $350 billion more spending power, but no perceivable effect. So where we are now is the third, which is stimulate consumption through the government buying. And that's what President-elect Obama has proposed. He's right to propose it. I hope that he also keeps in mind, and this is a danger he may not, but I think he will, that you need to have long-term jobs in the private sector. So be very careful that your stimulus package includes incentives to rehire, retrain in the private sector. But until you have consumption from individuals starting up again, it's perfectly sensible to have the government be the one to stimulate growth.
What are the kinds of things that will help stimulate the economy? And as they look at this massive package, are there areas where it makes more sense to spend money than other areas?
Yeah, and first of all would be the tax incentives to hire people. President-elect Obama has said something which other presidents have said has not yet been tried, and that is a very specific targeted tax credit for hiring more people. And the reason it hasn't been tried is very difficult to calibrate. I lay off only 50. I could have laid off 150. Please give me a tax credit. Yeah. That's harder to measure. But that would be one such example. Another, very important for Silicon Valley and California, is to maintain the preference for those who invest. It's not a question of class conflict here, and it's not a question of rich and poor. It's a question of if you want people to get jobs, then the tax structure should incentivize people to invest. So that's where I'd say the real focus for the long-term growth of private sector is. But in the interim, public works. Yeah, construction is down terribly, right? So some of the construction trades could be very profitably employed in public works construction. Airports, facilities, port facilities, water projects in the state of California, road building, construction of schools.
Should the automobile industry be bailed out?
No, they should not.
They should be allowed to fail?
Yeah, I believe so.
There'll be a huge loss in jobs. That's the first thing you hear.
Yeah, I disagree. Be careful, obviously, and I'm not saying that other people are wrong necessarily. I'm just giving you my very best judgment. I respect other points of view on this, but it's a very, very dangerous argument that if you don't have the federal government bail out 3 automobile manufacturers who have shown their incompetence, who've shown their inability to respond to what consumers want, to environmental needs, to the world economy, who have for years had as their success strategy keeping out foreign imports because they couldn't compete with them, then you're running a great risk of rewarding incompetence and rewarding failure. So will all of those people be unemployed? By no means. What happens when you go through bankruptcy is those people who have been owners of that failed model, they lose their money. But the assets are good. The manufacturing facilities can be retooled. General Motors and Toyota put together a retooled facility right here in Fremont to make a car with Japanese technology and General Motors employees. It can be done, so the assets will move then to a better management. That's the way it should be in a free market economy. And if you go the other way, you run the risk of postponing the inevitable, wasting a lot of taxpayers' money, and rewarding inefficiency.
Back to the stimulus package, how big should it be? I mean, can you argue that it can't be big enough, or do we really need to address this very judiciously? Because we're talking about real money here.
Great question, and the only way to answer it is to say, so what's the risk if you do too much? And the risk if you do too much is inflation. Because nobody is proposing that we increase taxes or fees in order to pay for this stimulus package. The proposal is we print money to pay for it. So what's the harm of inflation? Well, obviously, interest rates go back up, choking off a recovery, and the consumer can't afford to pay for things. But there's no sign of inflation in the economy. There will be a bulge of liquidity, and that will show up in higher prices probably when the recovery is 6 months, 8 months on its way, but not now. So the answer to your question is probably you cannot do enough. And then we will deal with inflation if we have the intestinal fortitude to do so by constraining the growth of government at that stage. But at this moment, no, there's effectively no constraint.
Go ahead. Because you say we can't do enough. It sounds like you can't do enough in the stimulus side, but you're very, very uneasy about the bailout side. Because we've also bailed out financial institutions that you could make the case showed the same level of incompetence.
I would make the case.
Yeah, so there's a distinction between a bailout versus a stimulus.
Yeah, there sure is. The bailout rewards failure. The bailout takes taxpayers' money and conveys it to owners who made a wrong investment and managers who showed incompetence. A stimulus package, by contrast, takes the nature of a public good. It's in everybody's interest to have better, more safely constructed, wider freeways. But it's in nobody's particular interest to spend the money to do it. We have to do that collectively. So that's exactly the difference.
How important is the speed of getting this package through? If you were in Congress today, what would you be looking for? Would you want to put together and get it through as fast as you can? Do you think they need to spend a little bit more time and take a hard look at where the money's going? How would you deal with that?
It's very difficult for me to say go spend as much as you can, as quickly as you can.
I don't see that's something you say.
Take my Chicago school degree back. I would be drummed out of the core of fiscal conservatives. But the psychology here becomes as important as the economics. It's a shame, I have to admit, that psychology is sometimes more powerful than economics. So there will be a big focus on the first 100 days, eerily comparing with the first 100 days of Franklin Roosevelt's administration. And there will be a call for, well, what have you done? And the market will respond to the perception of activity. So I think fast is very, very important. Secondly, if the federal government assists states with infrastructure projects, which is probably the likeliest step that they're going to take, that gets people employed very, very quickly.
Give us your impressions of the new administration. Obviously, it's a very hopeful time for people. And it also appears to be a time in which he's going to try and get past the historic politics of polarization, to which, of which to some degree you've had to struggle as a moderate Republican. So what's your sense going in? What are your hopes?
I think the president-elect has a tremendous opportunity. I think that Democrat and Republican, moderate, conservative, and liberal all want him to succeed. He's an historic president for many, many reasons. Among them, that we are in desperate need right now of reassurance domestically, reassurance internationally. And so I think there's a broad spectrum of enthusiastic support and optimism for him. And I think that the team he's assembled reflects a very commendable direction towards the center. I don't see a single lefty, far left radical, and I don't see a single far right righty, if you want to say it, whatever the correct phrase is. What I see are folks who know government, who are centrists, who are not ideological. They were driven by ideals, of course, but are able to make a compromise happen, which is so essential. So I'm optimistic. There's not a single appointment so far do I feel comfortable in criticizing. Mm-hmm. And let me just say, recent news about Leon Panetta. He was my colleague in Congress. We had neighboring districts, and also we worked together in California Forward. You may be familiar with that organization to reform California. And he's a Democrat. I'm a Republican, and I have the highest regard for him.
What about the Republican Party? Obviously, the party is in a, you could say a state of disarray, but is kind of searching for an identity. Where does the Republican Party go from here, do you think?
Nationally, it has to be responsive for a while. Nationally, if it is seen as having prejudged President Obama's administration, it would be bad for the country and therefore bad for the party. Wrong thing to do. It has to be responsive. Secondly, it has to be constructive. If President Obama has a plan that's 65% good, then the Republican leadership should identify the 35% that isn't and the 65 that's good and say, let's proceed with the 65. I think there is a danger in any partisan institution of always emphasizing the negative or the difference. I would say it'd be very wise for the Republican Party to spend a year and maybe a year and a half being careful and presenting to the public the reality of conciliation and compromise. Now, if I'm wrong, contrary to my wish, and President Obama goes off the course of moderation, embraces, let's say, a very radical left-wing agenda, then you'll see polarization come back very quickly heading into the midterm elections.
Okay. Tom, stay with us. We'll be right back and continue our discussion with former Congressman Tom Campbell. Stay with us.
Since the dawn of civilization, humans have sought knowledge and wisdom. The quest to answer the mystery of life is carried on for thousands of years.
But you can learn all the answers easily. Just watch these amazing high school students on Bay Area Quiz Kids. Each week, 2 teams from across the Bay Area compete for an incredible grand prize. Watch Bay Area Quiz Kids each Saturday at 2 p.m. on KRON.
Look around. Technology is everywhere.
It affects all of us, so it pays to know the latest high-tech trends.
At Tech Close-Up, we spot what's hot and what's not before you hear about it anywhere else.
We meet the folks who dream up these incredible innovations that change our lives.
We're coast to coast, covering the full scope of the high-tech world.
Plus, we make it understandable, and more importantly, we make it fun.
So stay on top of this fast-paced, high-tech world we live in.
Don't miss Tech Close-Up.
Because I have a doctor's appointment. Because I'll see if something's coming.
Because I've done it before. Because I can get out of the way in time.
Because is no excuse. Be smart. Be safe. Wait for the gate.
Welcome back to the game. I'm Mark Simon. He's Bob Marks. Over here we have Tom Campbell, former congressman, state senator, former dean of the School of Business, the Haas School of Business at Berkeley, currently a professor at Berkeley and soon to be at Chapman down in Orange County. We're talking about the economy. Let's talk a little bit about California's economy. Yeah. But let's start by saying, so you really want to be governor?
It casts in doubt any perception of my intelligence. I understand.
You are seriously thinking about running?
I am indeed.
You are inclined to run?
I established an exploratory committee the day after I finished my term as dean at Berkeley. Berkeley has terms for deans. Under law, if you spend, I think, $1,000 or more in connection with a political enterprise, you have to form a committee. Right. So that's what I did. But I haven't done anything officially since then. been. I've been working to ask my friends to consolidate, find out if there's support, get some very strong advice about what should be done for California, and set up a website. And so that's the steps that I've taken, but I've not made a formal decision.
There's such overt chaos in Sacramento about this budget crisis.
My gosh, isn't there? Yeah.
What would you do?
I would immediately, there's a short term and a long term, but let's talk immediate. I would immediately take the number of dollars cuts that the Democratic leadership are proposing, and to the best of my ability to perceive, it's really 3.8. It's not 7.8. It's about 3.8 real billion dollars. And then I would match it with 3.8 billion from an increased gasoline tax. And that together, 7.6, is enough to get Public Works started again. Because as we sit here and talk right here today, Public Works in the state of California funded by bonds are frozen.
Right.
And it's a killer during a recession. And it's not because I believe we should have higher taxes, and it's not because I believe we can't control spending. We ought to, and I would rather have lower taxes. But we have a crisis. Today, no Public Works. We need to get them started again. Now, long term, clearly we've spent more than we should. Here's the best statistic I can offer to compare about that. When Gray Davis introduced his first budget, when he was first year as governor, take those numbers, bring them forward for the cost of living, and bring them forward for the population growth, we would be in surplus today. So we've spent far faster than inflation, far faster than population growth. And the only way to control that, and it's going to take maybe 5 to 10 years to do it, is gradually migrate the state budget so that you don't spend the money you expect to come in, which is what we do now, but instead you collect the money and keep it earning interest for 1 year. You spend last year's money. That way there's no disagreement as to how much there is.
Certainly spending went up. How much of the problem was also made worse by cutting the vehicle license fee?
Oh, any element can be identified as adding to the deficit, or failing to increase the gas tax with the inflation. Just the gas tax is stated 18 cents per gallon, gee, for longer than 20 years. So yes, any of those can be identified. Both are true. Long term, you might remember we had an initiative Governor Schwarzenegger proposed, and I was chairman of the campaign, that would set constraints on spending more than we have. And the people rejected it. People rejected it by, 20 points or more. So there was a problem of getting a coalition of liberals, conservatives behind it and say, look, we can't spend more than we have. We can disagree, Democrat and Republican, over what we should spend. And we can disagree over how much we have to spend. Maybe we should have a vehicle license fee. Maybe we should have a gas tax. Maybe we should have an income tax. Maybe we should have a sales tax. But once we have the money, let's not spend more than what we have. That's what we would have done.
We seem, looking at it, we always seem to be stuck in the mud up there, but clearly right now, at what point does this situation get serious, get out of control? How close are we to it?
We're there already.
Yeah.
The key to me was in mid-December when the Pooled Money Investment Board, two Democrats, one Republican, obscure part of state government, but three very serious individuals, made the decision that we could not in good faith continue spending money on bond-funded projects because we didn't have the money. Now that is when you know all the red lights are on. So the short term, if there is not movement along the 50-50 proposal that I made, I think is reasonable. But if there's not movement, then there's one of two ways of going. One is unconstitutional, and the other is constitutional but more difficult. I suspect you'll see the unconstitutional step, and that is the Democratic leadership and the governor appear to be willing to pretend that you don't need a 2/3 vote for a tax increase.
By calling it fees,
by calling it
revenue neutral.
That's right, and it's not true. That's false. It's unconstitutional.
On the constitutional side, the Bay Area Council is very notably putting together a constitutional convention against a backdrop of a Republican minority who won't vote for the very things you said are the solution, which is matching tax increases. Is it fundamentally broken? Is it time for fundamental reform of this state?
I think that it is time for fundamental reform, and the step that I would take is the budget reform that I described. Take the money that we raise, let it earn interest for a year, and spend it a year and ahead so that you never have a doubt as to how much you have. That's fundamental, and that will prevent us ever again from having a budget imbalance. The proposal about the 2/3 has come back, but it's important to put that in context. It's not so much that there's a 2/3 required for a budget that's a problem. It's that it requires 2/3 for a tax increase. And I happen to think that's a good idea, because otherwise the natural inclination, believe me, of the legislature is to increase taxes. A statistic I'm sure you're aware of, but it's frightening, is that the personal income tax in California, the top 3% of California income tax filers pay 50% of all of the personal income tax in the state. Top 3% pay 50%. And it'll only get even more skewed if you lowered that 2/3 requirement. Also, we're not alone. 11 states have a more than majority requirement for increasing taxes. So the responsible step is to work within that structure, and to my judgment, that would be get enough Republican votes to join with the majority Democratic votes and the governor for a 50-50 solution in the present crisis. Every dollar you get in cuts, in real cuts, will match with a dollar in revenue.
How do you get Republican votes for taxes when many of them have signed a written pledge saying they would never increase taxes?
I think the most important pledge, and I know the most important pledge every legislator believes she or he has made, is to her or his constituents, to represent them and to serve the interests of the people of California. I have no doubt if the individual legislator believed that the crisis required a balanced solution, they would approve it, even if they had at some earlier point signed a pledge. I really believe that, and I don't think that we should overemphasize the pledge. Now the key, and if I do decide to run for governor, I hope it would be viewed as an advantage, is that the governor has to be able to work with both political parties and with his own party. We got to have, when I was budget director, for example, we delivered the budget in the 1 week into the new fiscal year, so almost on time. No new taxes, no new borrowing, and no gimmicks. And I went to the Republican caucuses in the Assembly and the Senate virtually every week and explained to them what we were doing. I'm a Republican, the governor's Republican. Bring them in, so that when we were ready with the budget, it was not news to them. Meantime, the Democratic leadership was working with me and the governor. A compromise is possible. We've had this rule about 2/3 in the budget for over 30 years. And we get budgets every year. So the present crisis can be overcome.
It seems odd in a way that it doesn't seem to be embarrassing enough to the people in charge.
Yeah.
The crisis we're in, and I don't mean that to be flippant.
Yeah, yeah. How bad must it be before?
Well, I mean, the tarnish that's being applied to the state's reputation and to the legislatures. I mean, there isn't a poll that shows anybody more unpopular than the legislators. And I'm surprised that doesn't drive them. You've been in that milieu. What's the sort of thinking that's going on?
As you know well, because you covered me when you were in journalism, I had a district which was very evenly balanced. Mm-hmm. And it would have been very difficult for an ideologue of the left or the right to stay in that position for long. You had to be pragmatic. Now, fortunately, I was pragmatic. I didn't have to change anything in order to represent the Silicon Valley districts that I had in Congress and in the state Senate. But among the steps that would be beneficial is open primary and neutral drawing of districts. Now, we got the latter. We just approved, the people of California just approved neutral drawing of district lines. So you no longer will have these remarkably one-sided districts where if you win the primary, you're safe for as long as you want. Open primary is the next improvement. As you might recall, I was very active in the effort to get the open primary. We had it for 3 years, and then the Supreme Court struck it down. So there's another effort coming around, and good organizations, Democrat and Republican, are getting behind an open primary. I think that would be the next step.
We're running short of time, but the two other people that are talking about running, Republicans from this area, I mean, it's amazing that all three are from this area. How are you different? In a word or two, how are you different from Meg Whitman, Steve Poizner?
At this stage, it's probably just the right thing and most polite thing for me simply to speak about my own candidacy. So I would offer the following. I was finance director of the state of California, and we did balance the budget, and we did get it within the first week, so almost on time. That was the third budget I was involved in. As a state senator, I was on the budget committee, and I was a state senator for 2 years. So I have 3 years experience working with exactly the issue that's of most concern to California right now, our economy and our budget. I was dean of the very greatest business school in the world. And it's a perfectly neutral judgment that it was perfectly the best business school in the world. And what do you do at a business school? You train people to hire people, to create jobs. I represented Silicon Valley in Congress for 5 terms, the most dynamic growth area of California, and I represented it from the state Senate as well. I have a PhD in economics. I was a professor at Stanford in the law school and a professor at Berkeley in the business school. I hope to offer some background and experience to the people of California if I choose to run.
Tom Campbell, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Mark and I will be right back with some final thoughts. Stay with us.
It's been over 150 years since Wells Fargo first opened for business. Since then, we've enjoyed your community support, and we're passionate about returning it. Every day, Wells Fargo team members roll up their sleeves and donate their time to organizations and charitable groups throughout the Bay Area. Nationally, we've committed even more. In just the past 2 years alone, we've donated over $70 million to support schools and educational programs. It's a commitment we're proud of. Wells Fargo, the next stage. If you live on the peninsula, there's only one place to get the latest news on business, sports, politics, education, and your community. Peninsula TV, Channel 26, the Peninsula and South Bay's Emmy Award-winning programming resource. For more information or for a programming schedule, go to pentv.tv or call us at 650-637-1936. Peninsula TV, your community programming channel.
Welcome back to the game. It's always a pleasure to talk to Tom Campbell because he's so bright and he's so earnest. But it makes me think the way they're dragging out this crisis, it could well be a crisis that spills over into the governor's race. And I guess what we can expect to see is a lot of people with very thoughtful suggestions about how to fix it, which sort of begs the question, why don't they fix it?
Yeah.
And I guess, you know, from the perspective of the people who are doing this, they must be frustrated, they must be unhappy, but they're not fixing it.
Yeah, and it's been going on for so long, I think people's expectations are fairly low in terms of that. But like we saw with the recent presidential race, I think the stakes are getting higher and higher for whoever is going to be the next governor. They're going to have a lot on their plate, and the need for fundamental change here in California is going to be a central figure.
Okay, well, that's all we have time for now.
I'm Bob Marks.
And I'm Mark Simon. Thanks for being with us, and join us next time on The Game.